Today's lesson is Matthew 25, 31 through 46. This is one of my favorite stories. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" The king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." This is the word of the Lord. This last judgment scene is the final and climactic story in Jesus' conversation about the end times. Recall in the last few weeks we've heard about the foolish widows who got shut out of the wedding banquet. We last Sunday talked about the fearful slave who buried the talent in the ground. Today's dramatic scene follows these parables and other conversation through which Jesus taught his followers what constitutes proper behavior as they await the return of the Lord in glory. And so here, Matthew provides the New Testament's really only detailed depiction of a great final courtroom scene in which the Lord will return and judge the nations. And in doing this, Matthew draws on imagery from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Remember Daniel in the lion's den. That's one of the only books in the Old Testament that talks about the apocalyptic times, the end times. So in Daniel it says, the Ancient of Days, God, is enthroned in glory and bestows on, quote, one like a son of man, who now Matthew is saying will be Jesus, will bestow what? Dominion and glory to set forth the full manifestation of God's reign. And so how does Jesus start his story? When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on the throne of his glory. And all the nations will be gathered before him. And he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put his sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Well, why does Jesus use this? Start out with all this amazing apocalyptic imagery, and then right away goes to the notion of like what the king's doing is like a shepherd separating the flock. Why the sheep and the goats? Well, in Palestine at this day, see, Jesus was a master storyteller. And in Palestine at this time, shepherds routinely had mixed flocks. At night, they would separate the sheep from the goats. And you could separate different flocks of sheep from each other too. Sheep enjoyed the open air of the pasture, but the goats had to be protected from the cold. And sheep were more commercially valuable, and so they were more highly prized than the goats. And now, the glorious Son of Man, like a shepherd, separates the sheep from the goats. Basically, the listeners can easily get tuned in to Jesus' story because of this familiar, everyday imagery. His stories were often filled with that everyday imagery. And so then he can begin to unfold the main point of the story, knowing that people are understanding. And once again, what he unfolds is about our proper behavior as we await his return in glory. It's about a whole way of life in God's kingdom on earth. Now, for years, I have viewed this story as a way, and maybe this is not all there is to it, but for me, this has been important. I have viewed this story as a way for Jesus to communicate his highest value, and to say that we, his followers, should make his highest value our highest value. And Jesus often in the Scriptures talks about his highest value in terms of being a servant. The greatest among us, he has said, is not one who lords it over others, but is the one who is the servant of all. And serving means giving others what they need in order to heal their suffering and to help them flourish as God would have them flourish. So then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you're blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom that has been prepared for you from the foundation of the world." And while this isn't the whole meaning, that sure is a powerful way of saying how important our being servants is to Jesus and to God. Then Jesus, or the king, goes on, "For I was hungry, and you gave me food." Here is what the serving is about. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. You know, there's no reason to not take this literally. People really are hungry in the world today. And people really are thirsty in the world today. And we can also take it symbolically, for we have many kinds of hunger and thirst. Jesus talked about those who thirst after righteousness. And we have hunger for new opportunities, and hunger for new hope, and hunger for healing, hunger for better relationships. We have lots of hungers and lots of thirst. And then I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Not everything is physical need. I thought about one kind of welcoming. It was in another city we lived in for several years, and there were a whole group of churches who combined with some government agencies, and they managed to help people coming out of prison find their way. So I want to tell you a little more about that in a second. Jesus goes on, I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. You know, we do really well with the sick and you took care of me in the church for one another, I think. Probably out of all these, we're strongest in that. Probably dealing with the prisons is probably the least of our successes. We don't talk about the prisoner. We don't visit the prisoner. We don't welcome the prisoner coming out of prison. Now, sometimes it does take a lot of effort by a lot of churches and institutions, but it also can be on a personal scale. I think I told you about this a long time ago, but that's all right, I'm going to tell you again. That's bad when I'm recycling stories, isn't it? But it's always been a powerful story to me. There was a young woman in the city where we lived, and she was a drug addict. She had a small child. And so one day she and some friends accidentally left some cocaine on the table, I guess the coffee table, and her little child got hold of it. So I had to go to the hospital, and then they found out what was in her bloodstream. And so the woman got into big trouble and got in the papers, and everybody just was despising her for what she did. And then she went to prison. And she was in prison for, I don't know, a couple of years anyway. And it was growing close to when she was going to get out, and so they put it in the paper, oh, she's going to get out. And of course they'd taken the child away from her, and the grandmother had to care for the child. She couldn't see her child. And so a couple people in our church felt that God was putting it on their heart to help this woman. It's sort of a real surprise out of the blue. And they talked to the congregation and got the congregation involved, and they asked me to go visit this woman while she was still in prison. And I did, 2 times. And then she got out, and there were church members there to welcome her when she got off the bus. And they were there to take her to where she could spend the night. And they were there to take her when she had to go visit the social worker to get started in all the process that she needed in order to find a place to live and a place to work. And so she got her little apartment, and then they began to collect furniture at the church because she had nothing. Jesus says all these things could have applied to her, really, you know. And so she had furniture. And they invited her to church, which is kind of unusual. You know, we help somebody in need, we don't think about them coming and be a part of our church, oftentimes. But they invited her to church, and she started coming and became part of the church family. And then as she worked the system, and the system helped her, she eventually was able to get back with her child. And I was in prison, and you visited me. Well, the righteous are puzzled, so they asked Jesus a question. Lord, when was it we saw you hungry and gave you food, thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it we saw you sick and in prison and visited you? And the answer that the king gives provides us with a whole new way of understanding Jesus and a whole new way of relating to him. So the king answered, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. And one thing Jesus is saying is that he stands in utter solidarity with those in need. And therefore our attitude toward those in need should be the same attitude that we would have if we were serving Jesus in his need. We should serve others with the same love, respect, humility, kindness, and lack of judgmentalism that we would give to Jesus. The woman who went to prison due to drugs, her child who accidentally got hold of the drugs, and the child's grandmother were the least of these about whom Jesus spoke. And you know many others of the least of these. Think how easy it would be not to welcome the woman when she got out of prison. But that is not Jesus' value, and it should not be ours. Well, next, Jesus pronounced judgment on the goats. The goats neglected those in need, and therefore neglected Jesus. And again, the ultimate context shows Jesus' value. For the goats were to be cast into eternal punishment. Serving those in need is so important that eternity hangs in the balance. Just like in those previous parables. The punishment is so way beyond what we think of that it really communicates a powerful message of where are God's values and where should our values be. The image is Jesus' way of communicating this and how we should embrace it if we are to be fit for living in God's kingdom. Now, much of the time, maybe all of the time, we are a mixed flock. We have a sheep side and we have a goat side. And sometimes we have to hold court with ourselves and see which side is predominating. And so if Jesus' highest value is ours, if that's what we claim, then we should always be working on developing that sheep side, addressing the real needs of others with a loving and respectful attitude. And then we will be getting to know Jesus better.